It was one of the greatest tragedies and one of the largest threats of all time. In all honesty, it's remarkable that reality even managed to survive it. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about one of the most important characters that Shattered Legacies has, and whilst they may no longer be relevant, nevertheless, their story makes up a large portion of the lore of Shattered Legacies. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the tragic beginnings and ultimate demise of the Dark Lord Xera. In order to start this off, we have to do a bit of background lore and kind of understand where exactly Xera came from, as well as some other important individuals. But suffice to say that this threat was so incredible that it's a wonder that reality even managed to survive to begin with. But of course, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. We need to discuss exactly who Xera is, where they came from, and why things went so disastrously wrong. This actually starts off at the very earliest point in the lore. Not the first bit of lore that I created, but rather chronologically the earliest bit of lore. And this is something known as the Origin War. However, Xera's story begins even before that ancient and devastating war that never technically ended. You see, there was an ancient species known as the Orotan. The Orotan were essentially a godlike species, and I don't mean that as in their capabilities or their technology was godlike. I mean they were quite literally a god-like race. Whilst they may not have had aspects, they were a species that were very adept at wielding both magical and divine phenomena. And as a result, and largely because they were really the only species that existed, the Orotan truly were the pinnacle of any race at their time. That being said, their entire species only numbered in maybe a couple of million, and they were only on one planet. But this is largely due out of personal choice rather than pure necessity. The Orotan understood that nature was by far more important than the own advancements of their civilization. Furthermore, they never really required technology. Sure, they had quote-unquote technology to a certain extent. They had various different tools in order to do the various different things that they had to do. Furthermore, the Orotan actually created the prototype for what we now know as the divine weapons. Granted, them possessing souls would come much, much later with the introduction of Tesha. But regardless, within this species there was two individuals of note. Xera himself, as well as the Origin Jackson, otherwise known simply as Zach Jackson, as that was his actual name. The two were close friends. However, they were startlingly different from one another. Zach seemed to be a prodigy of all things. No matter what he did, he excelled, and he excelled phenomenally within it. His physical prowess was unrivaled even by the adults. His magical and divine capabilities will easily outstretch that of some of the best in their race. He was a very bright, shining star. Then you had Xera, and keep in mind, Xera was never jealous of Zack, despite the fact that Zack had everything that Xera lacked. Xera was born feeble. He could barely use magic, let alone divinity. He was incredibly weak and seemed to struggle with a multitude of various different things. Despite this, like I said, he never really envied Zack. In fact, he loved and respected Zack more than anybody else, and his sole goal in life at that point was solely to prove to Zack that he had some way that he could be useful, despite the fact that Zack loved and respected Xera just as much. In fact, the two were basically brothers, given how close their bond was. However, Xera could never get it out of his head that he was so inferior to Zack, and he wanted to find a way to strengthen himself. That way he could assist Zack with whatever research he decided to do. Well, it turns out that all of the knowledge that the Oroton had was in this special archive, and every single book, tome, and scroll that has ever been made by Oroton hands was within there. However, there was a very special section, chained off with magical and divine wards and shields. And this section was known as the Blanked Archive, and it was full of various different things that, should the Oroton King have his way, would never see the light of day again. And in fact, there was only one person who could get within the Blanked Archive, and that was the king himself. Now, Zack and Xera had both been raised to know that the Blanked Archive was off limits, and for good reason. It wasn't like a boogeyman, how they said that bad children go in there and then they never come out. No, they were fully taught exactly what is in there and why it's so dangerous. And as a result, the two never had any desire. Well, Xera, being the curious child that he was, wanted to find some way of improving himself, as I've said multiple times. And he ended up walking into a different part of the archive that he wasn't particularly familiar with. He ended up finding a leather-bound, what could best be described as a journal. It didn't appear to have any case or any restrictions on it, yet it was on a plinth in the middle of the room. Xera, not entirely certain what it was, but he felt drawn to it, and he ended up taking the book, assuming that it was just a normal part of the archive. As we'll find out later, he was woefully mistaken. Eventually, time passes. Xera began reading the journal and was astonished by some of the things that was in here. Incredibly dark and gruesome. Various different spells and runes. Xera, needless to say, had questioned why this was in the archive. This almost seemed a borderline like something that should be in the Blanked Archive, but it clearly wasn't. Eventually, many years end up going past. Both of the children end up growing up, and they take their roles in society. Because of how much of a prodigy he was, Zack quickly became a close aide to the Oroton King, whereas Xera, constantly fascinated by various different books and journals, essentially became a scholar. And whilst he never published any of his own findings, he was nevertheless enraptured by it. Well, it turns out that roughly around the time that they were becoming adults, Xera discovered a ritual within that leather-bound journal. It seemed almost too good to be true. An ancient ritual that could be reformed and bind the soul of a entity, spirit, or god to him. You see, back then, gods weren't what we understand gods to be now. They were simply beings that lacked any form of sentience. They were sapient, to say the very least, but they didn't have really any higher mental faculties about them. They had incredible power, but largely ran off of instinct. These gods of the era ended up becoming known as the Old Gods, some of them even garnishing specific names and powers that they may or may not have had, such as Kronos, the old god of time, who is said to be able to control every single facet of time with no restrictions. Needless to say, Xera was curious. There was never really any taboo about binding a spirit entity or god's soul to their being. Whilst Oroton certainly possessed incomplete immortality, the same as gods do, their lifespan was relatively short compared to these true old gods and spirits at the time. Nothing more than the blink of an eye. What does it matter if a mortal binds you? Not only that, but like I said, they were running off of pure instinct. They didn't have any thoughts of, this mortal is going to be binding me, and thus I will, in a way, serve this mortal. The ritual seemed far too good to be true. It allowed for immense, immeasurable power to be granted to the caster of it, and that the god, spirit, or entity would be bound completely to the soul of the caster. Xera decided that this was the one that he was going to do, and once again he was rather surprised that such a seemingly mundane ritual was within this borderline book of horrors. Nevertheless, he decided to go to the central plaza. You see, within Oroton society, it's similar to the Yevens. It wasn't considered taboo to practice magic or divine abilities, much less in a public area. As a result, as Xera began preparing the ritual, there were certainly some odd looks, as this wasn't something Xera typically engaged in, but it also wasn't out of the ordinary for Oroton to do such a thing, even if it was the central plaza. And, again, even if something were to go wrong, or potentially go wrong with the ritual. Well, it just so happens that Zach was spending some time within the archive. It was only roughly 2 years prior to the current events that the king of the Oroton had decided that the blanked archive needed more staff rather than just himself, and as such, he opened it to a very select few. The king's aide, this being Zach, who spent the majority of his time within the archive anyway, as well as a few other mages and sorcerers, who had an immense amount of respect for both the king and for Zach, due to both of their capabilities. Well, it turns out that Zach had noticed something within the blanked archive. An empty plinth. There was clearly something supposed to be there, but he couldn't identify what it was. The plinth wasn't new. There had recently been add-ons to the blanked archive, but this plinth was old. Incredibly old. Far older than he had been alive for. He asked the king, and the king immediately was worried, but just simply thought that the leather-bound journal that would normally be there somehow got lost within the blanked archive somewhere. The king decided that he was going to go off for a little bit of a stroll, and it just so happened that he was going to the central plaza. He'd informed Zach, and Zach said that he understood, and went back to his work. It was only after Zach had been thinking and organizing the blanked archive for a while that he remembered a rather strange journal, or book, that Xera always seemed to have near him. Leather-bound, and the pages themselves seemed to be incredibly old, almost to the point of deteriorating every single time he turned the page. Furthermore, they had utterly bizarre and almost dark-looking symbols and runes on it. At the time, Zach didn't really think of it. We now go back to Xera, who has almost completely set up the ritual. It's at this point that people are really starting to pay attention to what Xera's doing, as this is a rather grandiose ritual circle. Certainly something that would normally be beyond the enfeebled scholar. People are curious and are starting to gather, wondering what exactly it is that Xera is going to be attempting, as, again, everybody is aware of just how, I don't necessarily want to say inept, but incapable that Xera is. He starts to begin the ritual, and almost instantly he feels sick to his stomach. There is an impossible weight of dread hanging within the central plaza. Little did Xera know that this was about to be the end times for him and his people. Going back to Zack once more, he suddenly felt a cold shiver run down his spine. For reasons that were never fully explained, Zack and Xera had a sort of link with one another. Whenever one was in danger or simply having heightened emotions, the other could feel it. And right now, Zack was feeling something that he had never felt before. A darkness, a malevolence, an evil, an unimaginable dread where Xera was. He immediately dropped everything, running out of the archive, telling the scholars that were there that he had to go to where Xera was. Again, everybody respected Zack so much that nobody really questioned it. They were concerned, given how fast he had left, but nobody was going to argue with the aid of the king. Despite the fact that Zack was easily far more capable than anyone else within his species, he still had his own limitations, and it would take him time to reach Xera at the Central Plaza. It's at this time that the king is starting to near the Central Plaza as well, and suddenly he feels this dark weight upon himself, that same dread. And he starts running towards the Central Plaza, and he sees Xera. He's instantly confused. Why is Xera here? And why does it appear that he's doing a ritual? And then he looks down at Xera's side and is even further confused. Why is the leather-bound journal here? Suddenly, there's a realization. Why is the leather-bound journal here? He immediately starts running towards Xera, demanding that he ends this ritual, saying that you do not understand what you have with you. Unfortunately, it is far, far too late. An entity, midnight black as the void itself, appears above the ritual. Everybody immediately snaps their attention to it, and it appears to be looking directly at Xera, despite the fact that it has no features whatsoever. It's almost like a silhouette. Something is there, but it's not. And it is emitting a horrendous, malicious intent all about it. It then appears to look across the plaza, and within an instant, screaming can be heard all across the planet. By the time this entity appears, Zack is nearly halfway to the plaza, and he feels this dark evil, almost as if the eye of hell itself has opened up and is staring at every individual on the planet. He then redoubles his efforts, using everything he has to run as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, even with that, it's too late, and it's as if the very sun itself blinks out of existence. Pure, abyssal darkness. Xera's senses slowly come back to him. He's aware that he exists. Then he's aware that he is on the ground. Then he's aware that he's in pain. Why is he on the ground and why is he in pain? Then he is aware that his eyes are closed, and he slowly opens them. His head is pointing to the left, and he immediately sees Zack sitting there, on what appears to be a stone seat. As his vision focuses, he realizes that it's debris. He isn't exactly sure where it's coming from, or where it came from, let alone why Zack is there. Then he becomes aware that Zack is holding a book. And then, a few seconds after that, he's aware that it's the leather-bound journal. Xera tries to get up, but Zack waves his hand and says, "Don't. You're far too injured." Then an awkward silence. And then Zack says, "Are you aware of what this book is?" And Xera shakes his head. Zack then says, "I'm not entirely sure how you got it. I'm not entirely sure what it is. All I know is that the king had it in the blanked archive for a good reason. I don't know how you got in there. I don't know how you got the book. Perhaps the king was in there that day and forgot to re-enable the wards and barriers at the door. It doesn't matter now. In all honesty, nothing seems to matter now." Xera is immediately confused by this. Why is Zack seemingly speaking in such a grim manner? He then rolls his head to the right and realizes why. Everybody that was in the plaza, the closest to him is the king, is lying on the ground, unmoving. He then becomes aware that each and every single one of them is in a horrifying state. It's almost as if they've been completely mummified, their bodies desecrated to the point of nothing more than sand-dry skin and brittle bones, hair completely gone, the life seemingly drained completely from their bodies. Zack then stands up and walks within view. "Do you understand now? I don't know what that ritual was. I don't know what happened here. I don't know how you and I are alive. But whatever you did caused the end of our race. I want you to know, Xera, I'm not upset with you. Hell, I'm not even angry. I am disappointed, but I suppose I can't blame you. Neither of us were aware of what this book was, and you've had it for so many years. Perhaps the other spells and rituals in the book should have been a hint, but both of us chose to be blinded to the truth. And unfortunately, we've paid the ultimate sacrifice." Xera immediately starts crying. He realizes what he's done, and while she's not entirely sure what will come about of this decision, he knows that the death of everyone, at the very minimum, within the city that they're in, is because of him. Suddenly, Xera experienced something that he's never experienced before. Unbridled rage and fury, and spite and hatred towards Zack. It terrifies him. He's never felt this before. He's always loved and respected Zack. Why is he so angry? Why does he hate Zack so much all of a sudden? Suddenly he feels something within him. An energy. Not magic, not divine, nor even the recently discovered psionics that was only just recently being experimented with. No. This is far older, far more primordial, far darker. Black energy starts to appear around Xera's hand, and before Zack can even register what is going on, he immediately throws up his strongest ward. A magical spell. He isn't sure what it is. In fact, he's not even sure if Xera is the one that's actually doing it, as he knows Xera can't cast spells. The spell is then launched directly at Zack from Xera's hands. He realizes within an instant of the spell making contact that one ward will not be enough, and he starts marshalling every single ward and barrier that he can possibly manage. the spell blasting through every single layer, almost as if it is nothing more than a bullet traveling through paper. Finally, the last barrier manages to stop it, ironically enough being the strongest barrier or ward that Zack has at his disposal. Both of them look shocked at one another. Xera isn't entirely sure what happened. The rage and fury has suddenly disappeared. Zack is utterly confused. Did Xera just try to attack him? No, more like kill him. But why would he do that? Not only that, but he looks utterly and totally confused, like he's not entirely sure that he even did it. Zack decides that perhaps this was just some freak accident, or perhaps a after effect of whatever the ritual was, as he's still not entirely sure what it is. When he had arrived, everything was in rubble. Everybody was dead, and the ritual circle appeared to have scorched the ground around it, being completely and utterly unrecognizable. He doesn't know which ritual it was, although he has an assumption that it was the spirit entity or god binding ritual at the back of the book, largely because it's the least dark looking of them all. Zack decides to wander off and search for any survivors, while Xera continues to just lie in the center of the town square. Nearly 30 minutes go by, and suddenly that rage and fury is back, that hatred and spitefulness, only this time it is far, far stronger, and Xera can't control it. Suddenly he gets up off his feet, feeling stronger than he's ever before. He actually feels strong, he feels agile, he feels powerful, and he immediately and unconsciously starts to go and hunt down Zack. He finally finds Zack and unleashes another one of the attacks. This time, Zack appears to be far more prepared for it, raising his strongest barrier, but once again the spell nearly breaks through. This time, it isn't a freak accident. Xera was hunting him, and Zack isn't entirely certain why. He doesn't believe that his friend has any ill will towards him. No. In fact, he's almost certain that whatever that binding ritual was didn't bind a spirit, god, or entity to him, but rather may have possessed Xera. As what he's feeling right now in Xera's emotions through their link, it's not Xera. It's cold, dark, and ancient. And it is filled with such unbridled, unending fury and hatred that it absolutely could not have been from Xera. Zack immediately prepares himself, preparing only defensive wards, as this is still Xera. He doesn't want to hurt his friend, and he knows that even a single one of his offensive spells or divine abilities could spell the death of his friend. Dark energy bolt after dark energy bolt is launched at Zack, and no matter where he goes, they seem to home in on him and follow him. Each time he fends them off, but just barely. He tries multiple different spells to bind Xera in place, restrict his movement, prevent his casting of the strange spell, but nothing seems to work. Every single time Xera breaks free, every single time Xera isn't affected by the nullifying effects of his own spells and divine abilities. It's almost as if Xera has become unstoppable. Then he feels it. It's as if a section of his own soul was ripped apart, torn away from him. That part that is Xera is suddenly gone. He doesn't know what happened. He doesn't think that Xera is dead, but he can't feel Xera anymore. And when he looks at his body coming towards him, preparing yet another dark bolt, he still sees his friend hidden deep, deep within his eyes, pleading, begging for help. Regardless, though, it's clear that Xera isn't the one in control anymore, and Zack doubts that he ever will be in control again. He understands that he can't keep defending. Whatever these dark bolts are, which seem to only grow with time, will eventually overwhelm his strongest barrier. He has to act. He has to do something. He has to strike down Xera. But he can't. He spent his whole life around Xera. The two were essentially brothers with one another. He can't simply just cut down his best friend. So he does the next best thing. His body is automatically reacting, preventing himself from attacking. So, he pulls a sword from a nearby barrel, which, conveniently, they were next to the blacksmith. He pulls the blade and immediately lashes out. Not for a killing blow, no, never that. But enough to strike the face. And, the prodigy that he is, his strike lands true, gouging a massive cut all the way up Xera's face. Suddenly it's as if he is out of his trance. Just that minimal damage, despite the fact that he can still see it's Xera, just that minimal amount of damage is enough to make him no longer think of this person as Xera. In fact, for a split second, while he has the time, he wonders if perhaps it was a trance. But he doesn't have time to truly and fully think that thought through. He immediately starts marshaling some of his more mediocrely powerful spells. He doesn't want to do enormous damage. He certainly doesn't want to cut loose. The king could barely withstand his most powerful spells. Xera wouldn't have a chance. He prepares the spells and launches them. Each and every single one connect with Xera's body. Each time it launches him backwards, sliding across the ground in a most unpleasant and painful-looking way. Yet every single time, impossibly, Xera stands up. His wounds appear to be slowly healing. In fact, the slash across his face appears to have completely scarred. Blood no longer runs. In fact, oddly enough, there isn't even blood on his face anymore. And whilst the cut isn't fully healed, it has scarred. Zack isn't entirely certain what is happening, but it's clear that mid-level spells won't be enough for this. He then apologizes to Xera, as once again, looking within Xera's eyes, he can still see his friend, begging for help, and accepting whatever Zack plans to do. Nevertheless, he apologizes, and prepares stronger and stronger and stronger spells and divine abilities, and lashes out against Xera, until eventually he's throwing his most powerful spells and abilities directly at Xera, and at this point, Xera's body isn't even flinching backwards, moving forward as if undaunted by the cataclysmic spells that have at this point completely and utterly annihilated the town, irreversibly damaged the ecosystem within this section of the planet. Yet he continues to lash out more and more and more, until he gets to the point where he realizes that divine abilities and spells won't be enough. He immediately goes in with his fists and starts punching Xera. The first hits launch him backwards, but as he continues to move forward, every single hit upon Xera seems to have a lessening effect, until finally he hits Xera, and Xera doesn't even move. Zack immediately moves backwards, faster than even Xera, or whatever is controlling Xera, is capable of perceiving, and draws the blade once more, then slashes. This time, he's going for a kill. The blade goes for the neck and nearly cuts his entire head off, his head hanging on by a small strand. The body simply grabs the head and flips it back onto the neck. And what Zack sees is impossible. It's almost as if the flesh is melting together where the cut was, until finally there isn't even a scar. Oddly enough, the cut on Xera's face is still a scar, but it's as if the cut never even happened. He continues to slash harder and faster with the blade, every single time the wound's healing, until once again, just like with the fist, his blade hits Xera's body and it simply bounces off. It doesn't even cut anymore. Zack doesn't understand what is happening, but he understands that whatever this is, it's not Xera, and its power is impossible. It's at this point that Zack finally retreats. He realizes that he can't stop Xera at this time, and he's starting to understand what it is that ritual did. It wasn't a binding ritual. No, it appears to have been a possession ritual. And it appears as though it wasn't some god or spirit that had possessed Xera. No, it was an entity. A dark entity. He remembers the king speaking of it once. He simply called it the Dark Queen. Zack remembers that he had commented to the king that it was a rather unimaginative name. The king simply chuckled, saying that whatever this entity is, it doesn't have a name. And he believes that trying to give it a real name could potentially give it a tangible link to their world, to them. So he simply gives it a title, the Dark Queen, and says that that's enough. He says that it is one of the only entities that should never be allowed to see the light of day. Its power is impossible. Even the king cannot withstand its corruption. Zack believes that whatever has control of Xera might be that Dark Queen. Of course, he has no proof. For now, all he can do is retreat to another Oroton city, see if perhaps there is anybody there who can assist him in any way. As he finally arrives days later, he realizes the horrid truth. This city and all of its inhabitants appear to have been desecrated in the same way as that central plaza. Zack comes to a horrifying realization. It wasn't just a spell with a radius. Zack believes that it took every single small, minuscule detail of Xera and affected everything like that. Meaning that spell, whatever it did, for whatever reason it claimed the lives of those within the Central Plaza, affected all Oroton across the planet. Now, unbeknownst to Zack, there was actually two others that were alive. Both Xera and himself, obviously. However, there was two others. One we won't talk about until we do their deep dive. However, the other was Tesha. And this is an important detail, as it's roughly around this time that the Origin War begins. The beginning of the Origin War happens not long after everything that I just described, and that story I just told. Zack eventually decides that he can't do this alone, and starts creating all of the minor and major races that we largely know of now today within Shattered Legacies. He creates them, makes them as powerful as he possibly can, as he is not an old god, he isn't capable of infinite power, but he has enough to create all of the species, and he rallies them together in one unified force. Suddenly, it's no longer one incredibly powerful individual, but now it's one incredibly powerful individual at the head of an army of, albeit be significantly weaker individuals that can all collectively attack at once. Unfortunately, Xera had similar ideas. Or at least, whatever the entity was. It was around this time that Xera started calling himself the Dark Lord. And it was at this specific point in time that he started to create his own beings. However, his power was significantly stronger than Zack's, as it was fueled by the Dark Queen. He raised an immortal army, specifically a complete immortality army. They could not be damaged, they could not be killed. They continued onwards, seemingly never running out of energy, constantly attacking, constantly slaughtering. Unfortunately, it was a one-sided war. Xera continued to gain more and more ground, until finally Tesha had arrived and had created the first generation divine weapons. Now, at a later date, during the final moments of his life, the Origin Jackson, or Zach Jackson as we've simply been calling him this whole time, ends up imprisoning Tesha for this great sin, despite the fact that it helped immeasurably in stopping Xera, at least for the time. It was still one of the greatest sins that he could have committed. And Tesha understood and accepted this, that despite the fact that their civilization no longer existed, he couldn't be given a free pass. This sin was putting a soul within an inanimate object. Eventually, however, the war starts to peter out. Slowly but surely, Xera's immortal legions are dealt with, and this is due to a joint effort between the Origin Jackson and Tesha, who create special devices known as imprisonment orbs. They're small spheres, roughly the size of a marble, and they're capable of imprisoning an entity, spirit, god, or mortal being within them. Luckily enough, this includes whatever Xera's army is, as well as Xera itself, or himself. Imprisonment orbs themselves have various different levels, and luckily, the mass-produced ones were just the right level to be able to withstand Xera's legions. Unfortunately, they weren't capable of creating an imprisonment orb that was strong enough to contain Xera. However, at the time of imprisonment, Xera didn't know this. As a result of Xera finally being sealed within an imprisonment orb, the Origin War was postponed. It wasn't finished. The Immortal Legion still lived. Xera still lived. However, similar to the Emperor of Mankind in Warhammer 40k with his battle against Horus, the Origin Jackson had been injured. It wasn't a fatal injury, but it was enough to ensure that he wouldn't be able to fight back should Xera return. As a result, Zach did the only thing that seemed reasonable in this situation. He couldn't do it himself, so he had to pass down the capabilities to do so, as well as the responsibility of doing it, to somebody else. He did two things. First, he activated a very, very old spell, almost ancient, like the Dark Queen. This would allow his name, his legacy, and for the most part his capabilities to be inherited by the next generation. When a person was born and they were destined to become Zach Jackson, they would immediately and unconsciously know at some point in their life that this was their calling. They would then abandon their name and take up the title, the Mantle of Zach Jackson, gaining the abilities of the first of the Origin Jackson. Time continued to move ever onward. Many Zach Jacksons arose. And it wasn't until roughly around the time that the legendary Jackson came into the picture that the second thing that the Origin Jackson did started to come about. This will have been around the time that Zach was first becoming a deity in terms of overall power. A utterly bizarre and unique phenomena was occurring. The gods couldn't identify what the hell it was. It was a strange, almost amorphous white spike. It appeared to be able to adjust its overall length, perfectly tailored to whoever was holding it. Furthermore, when this spike was thrown, it instantaneously moved to the location of impact. In fact, as the gods observed, and Legend was largely the one who experimented the most with it, it didn't appear to actually move from the hand to the impact site. Rather, it appeared to just spontaneously appear within the impact site in less time than even the gods could calculate. In less time than even the Techno-Jackson, the most intelligent of all Zach Jacksons, and most intelligent being to ever exist, could calculate. This item, completely and utterly unknown as to what it was given a name: the Godless Lance. Most interestingly of all, it appeared to be able to bind to the soul of its master. However, it appeared that it could rebind itself to anybody else that it then called master, similar to divine weapons without the rebinding aspect of it. As a result, Legend ended up becoming its master. However, he almost never used it, largely because the gods didn't really understand what it was. Now we go even farther, and we get to the point where Legend becomes a supreme god for the first time. The very first supreme god. The supreme god of creation. And another one of these utterly bizarre items was discovered. It's the same. A nearly amorphous white substance that appeared to be almost resembling a shield. At this point, they had done plentiful research into the Godless Lance, and they realized that it was the dictionary definition of an unstoppable object. No matter what it was thrown at, it would instantaneously appear within its target. It could not be dodged, it could not be blocked, it could not be parried, it could not be escaped. It would hit its target every single time. Then they discovered the second one, and it was eventually given the name the Gilded Aegis, as it appeared to be the direct opposite of the Godless Lance, an immovable, impenetrable object. Interestingly enough, when the two came into contact with one another, when the Godless Lance was launched at the Gilded Aegis, everybody appeared to have lost their memories as to what exactly occurs when the two collide with one another. This, needless to say, worried the gods immensely, as if they can't remember what happened, they can't exactly identify what could potentially go wrong as a result of them colliding again. As a result, a rule was made within the gods. These two are never to come into contact with one another. Then a third was discovered, then a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, and finally the last one, an eighth. Each of them appeared to have impossible capabilities that defied even the understanding and feasibility of the gods themselves. They were eventually called the 8 Divine Commandments. If you're thinking of the 10 Commandments from the Bible of Christianity, you're wrong. These aren't a code to live by, which, to be fair, the 10 Commandments is a pretty damn good code to live by. They were called the Divine Commandments simply because they appeared to be able to command basically all of reality. Even gods were subservient to the abilities of these items. Furthermore, depending on which one was used, they could even damage and maybe even kill supreme gods, such as the Godless Lance. Whilst it had never been tested in an attempt to kill a supreme god, it was tested to see if it could damage a supreme god. This supreme god that was chosen was the supreme god of destruction, Tobias, and they decided that they were going to throw the Godless Lance at his arm. What ended up happening was that Tobias's entire arm ended up exploding on impact with the godless lance. Needless to say, the injury eventually healed and a new arm was regrown, but it was very obvious that some of these divine commandments were capable of affecting supreme gods, despite the fact that there was an impossibility because of their complete immortality. Which, once again, complete immortality is essentially invulnerability. Their bodies and even their clothes cannot be damaged under any circumstances, oddly enough, with the exception of these divine commandments. But of course, we're a bit ahead of ourselves in the timeline. We need to go back to when Legend first became a god. This was the first instance in which Legend ever encountered Xera. Xera's original idea and goal was the complete and utter annihilation of reality. He believed it to be anathema to whatever the Dark Queen believed in. And as a result, this eventually became Xera's goal, the complete and utter obliteration of reality. After his failed attempt during the Origin War, Xera became significantly more subdued. When Legend first encountered him, he was still nothing more than a greater god. Xera appeared to be just like anybody else, simply a passerby, only the two just so happened to barely touch shoulders. Xera never seemed to notice, but within the split instant of their shoulders touching, Legend had felt an impossible malevolence, an impossible abyssal darkness that existed within this random man. Xera at this point had been gaining information. What was reality like? What was it defended by? And more importantly, what was the caliber of these new beings calling themselves gods, as unworthy of the name as they were? There was only one true god, and that god happened to live within him. Xera had no idea just how much of a problem Legend was to become. In fact, he didn't even register that when he touched Legend's shoulder, that Legend even existed in the first place. However, the two never really came into conflict with one another at that time. Later on, we get to the point where Zack became an Onin for the first time, nothing more than a lesser one, and he encountered Xera once more. Xera had just instantaneously and impossibly vaporized an entire planet. He didn't destroy it, turning into nothing more than space debris. No. He simply clicked his fingers and it quite literally vaporized on the spot. At this point, Legend had quite firmly stated that he was the guardian of all of reality, and he took issue to this. He initially engaged Xera, however, was beaten so badly that he was forced to retreat. Xera, once again, didn't really give him any thought. This was simply another being who had called itself a god. It wasn't worthy of the title. It wasn't the Dark Queen. As a result, it couldn't be a god, nothing more than a strange mortal being that possessed far more power than any of the others. It was inconsequential and not even worth a moment of his time or memory. Next, we get to when the godless lance was first discovered, and once again, Legend ended up encountering Xera once more. This is the first major conflict between the two. There isn't a lot of information about this, as I never really thought out the lore that much, but suffice to say, Xera ended up receiving the gift of his once best friend. This gift being the godless lance directly through the gut. Shockingly enough, this did very little damage, but did fully pierce through Xera's body. He then, finally, decided to grant Legend a moment of his attention. You see, Xera hadn't just been gathering information this whole time. He had also been further refining the abilities of the Dark Queen, growing even more powerful. That simple dark energy bolt that he threw at his best friend all of those eternities ago, that was nothing more than the capabilities of a small child compared to what he could do now. He lashed out with an impossible, corrupting power that immediately collided with Legend, dealing unimaginable amounts of damage, nearly killing him on the spot. At this point in time, Legend really was one of the most powerful gods that existed, but he barely survived. Luckily, Legend ended up, a very long time ago, having an encounter with a being known as the Nightmare Child. We've talked about that before. Well, he learned a valuable lesson that day, and that is that imprisonment orbs are awesome. And wouldn't you know it, he had one of the strongest ones he's ever seen. In fact, it's the very same imprisonment orb that the Origin Jackson stuck Xera in the first time. Xera eventually broke out, but it wasn't because he realized that he was stronger than the imprisonment orb. Rather, he simply thought that it simply must be a specific amount of time that this strange prison cell can hold him. Well, he ended up encountering this very same damnable prison a second time, as Legend threw the imprisonment orb at Xera, almost like a Pokeball, and Xera immediately entered the imprisonment orb once more. Needless to say, annoyed, but not realizing that he could simply break free whenever he wanted. Legend ended up keeping the imprisonment orb on him at all times as he continued to grow more and more powerful. He started to understand the godless lance even further. Finally, he had elevated himself to supreme god and discovered the gilded aegis. Slowly but surely, a plan started to form in both of their heads. Xera eventually figured out that he was actually superior to the imprisonment orb and could leave whenever he wanted. However, he specifically chose not to. Of course, that may seem like a wild notion. Why wouldn't he want to escape? Well, it turns out that he could be given incredibly useful information by staying within this imprisonment orb. As so long as Legend had it in his direct contact, he could more or less hear what was going on around him. As a result, he too started to gain a fairly decent understanding of this godless lance and whatever this gilded aegis might be. Xera started to realize that this was well beyond what these mortal gods were capable of, and there was only one person who could possibly create something so devious. His best friend, Zack, the blighted prodigy. It was at this point that the spite and hatred had grown even further, to the point where it started to affect Legend himself. Eventually, Legend decided that he had had enough of the seemingly cursed orb and ended up throwing it in a random corner, always aware of where it was and always keeping an eye on it to ensure that Xera was still inside. Eventually, Xera started to get bored and decided to break free. Little did he know that the entire time that he hadn't had contact with Legend had been plotting his own idea. When the idea of the Divine Commandments first came into being, he realized that some of these items could actually be used in conjunction with one another. Eventually, when all 8 were discovered, he realized that he could use all of them at once. Oddly enough, it was only after all 8 had appeared that something impossible happened. Once all 8 had been gathered in one location, there was a blinding flash. Even Legend couldn't see through it. And when it finally subsided, at the very center of all 8 items, which hadn't been organized in a circle, stood a man. The man was completely unknown and appeared to be almost in a trance-like state. Yet, for reasons that Legend couldn't quite explain, he recognized this person. He's never seen him before. He doesn't know who this is. Not even the faintest of recollections. But somehow, he knows who this is. And as the individual appears to exit their trance, it finally clicks. It can't be. There's no possible way. The person was killed. In fact, he used up his own life force to stop it all. But here he stood. The Origin Jackson. Impossibly stood before Legend, and seemingly instantly understood that the person that was also standing in front of him was a descendant. One of his chosen. Whilst he knew absolutely nothing about this Zach Jackson, he understood that this was the next person in line. Or at least he believed that this was the next person in line, not realizing that there had been thousands of Zach Jacksons between him and Legend. The two eventually got to talking. Legend ended up asking about the Divine Commandments. Origin was amused, as well as confused, as to what Legend was talking about, and then realized what he was referring to. Origin then said that what he is wielding is nothing more than Origin's willpower. This, needless to say, confused Legend. How could something as intangible as willpower become a physical object capable of impossibilities that even gods can't compare to? Origin then countered, saying, "Have you ever tried?" Legend was a bit bewildered by this statement, but regardless. They continued to talk, and Legend slowly got a more general and firm understanding of what the Divine Commandments were and were capable of. However, Origin also stated that even he wasn't entirely certain what they could be capable of at their full potential, as they appeared to have changed dramatically from when he originally created them. He also stated that he was rather surprised that it took this long for them to manifest, largely due to the fact that when he originally created them, they already had a physical state. They didn't appear to be frayed and shredded at the edges. Nothing more than a faint imitation of what they once were. The Godless Lance was once a very well-defined and immaculate-looking spear. The Gilded Aegis was a shield of unmatched ornate splendor. The rest equally had their own hyper-detailed designs. Now they were nothing more than a shredded echo of what they once were. Now, to state, we only know the true identity of 3 of the Divine Commandments. Whilst we have seen all 8 of them, we only know the identities and rough capabilities of 3 of them. These being the first Divine Commandment, known as the Godless Lance, which appears to be the unstoppable object, capable of piercing and penetrating through any defense, hitting any target, no matter where it is, regardless of the distance, regardless of how fast the individual is, and regardless if they move. We know of the second Divine Commandment, known as the Gilded Aegis, the direct opposite of the Godless Lance. It is capable of defending against any onslaught, no matter how vicious and destructive it may be. Then we know of the identity of the 4th Divine Commandment, known as Abyssal Midnight. Its exact capabilities are unknown, but it appears to be an amorphous black and white energy that is capable of flowing like water and seemingly responds to the will and desire of the master. We should also note that these commandments haven't reached their full potential, even when the final conflict finally happens. This happens a long, long time after Xera releases himself from the imprisonment orb. An ancient war ends up going down. Well, ancient by the current time of Shattered Legacies. Legend and Xera finally have their showdown. Legend wielding all 8 of the divine commandments at once, an impossible power and the pure will of Origin, who at this point no longer possesses a physical state, nothing more than a fragment of a soul now residing within Legend. Xera has only continued to grow this dark energy that he has access to thanks to the Dark Queen, and has become even closer to being one with the Dark Queen. It's getting to the point where differentiating the Dark Queen from the Dark Lord Xera is becoming nearly impossible, as the two appear to be merging. The showdown commences, and through the raw, unbridled fury of all divine commandments, Legend finally manages to strike down Xera at quite literally the last moment. Now, there's something that we need to talk about before then, and that is specifically the opposite of divine weapons. But of course, I can hear you asking, what is the opposite of a divine weapon? They're known as the cursed blades. Now, why did I save this part for the very last, considering it seems to be fairly important? Well, why not? I had a reason, but I immediately forgot it. When Xera had created his army, he had created 5 unique individuals, known as the 5 firstborn of Xera. These 5 individuals were unique. They weren't the rank and file of his immortal legion, who were essentially like Necron warriors. They didn't possess their own wills, let alone their own minds. They were essentially automata that did the bidding of Xera, without the whole robotic aspect. However, the 5 firstborn of Xera were different. They were individual beings. Unfortunately, we've lost the names of 4 of the firstborn of Xera, and this is largely due to the gods constantly erasing any record of them from existence. However, through the utterly determined efforts of Legend and also Xera bringing it up every once in a while, we know the name of the firstborn of Xera. We also know that at this specific time, Xera was not in control. Not his mind nor his body was in control. In fact, it is believed that it was the Dark Queen herself that was in total control at this specific time, when the firstborn of Xera were created. The firstborn himself was named Zach Jackson. This was technically the first person to have taken up the mantle, the title of Zach Jackson, after the Origin Jackson, and as a result, he was given the title of Ancient, hereforth known as the Ancient Jackson. This was a bit of a interesting individual, as once again, we have another deep dive that we'll get to eventually, beings known as the Infinity Dragons. Now, what exactly they are and who they are isn't exactly important right now. All that we need to know is that one of these Infinity Dragons happened to be a particularly large thorn in Xera's side. And as a result, Xera doing what Xera does best, he essentially shattered the Infinity Dragon into 2 separate parts. A feral dragon state that housed all of the power of this Infinity Dragon, and the mind of the creature, who then he formed into the Ancient Jackson. You see, this Infinity Dragon was known as Vega, the Infinity Dragon of Desolation, which if you know what that word means, you understand what this firstborn of Xera was all about. Xera ended up creating cursed blades. 6 in total. 1 for each of his 5 firstborn, now known as his 5 generals. Each one carried one into battle. When we cover specifically Benimaru, one of the certain calamities, we'll talk about the ancient Jackson's cursed blade, known as the cursed blade Madra. However, what's really important right now and why all of this is relevant is because Xera himself has his own cursed blade. Immediately after creating it, the Origin Jackson understood how dangerous it was, and essentially yeeted the blade through time and space to prevent him from using it. The cursed blade was simply known as Calamity. Calamity on its own was incredibly powerful. Was it as powerful as, say, Tenjai Kuroga? No. But it could certainly amplify the overall capabilities of Xera to an impossible level. However, it had one very, very specific trait, and the main reason why the Origin Jackson got rid of it in the first place. It would allow Xera the power to instantaneously annihilate all of reality. However, it had a criteria, and this criteria was set forth by the Dark Queen. Xera has to abandon all humanity, or whatever the Oroton equivalent of it is. He had to completely let go and completely and utterly merge with the Dark Queen, at which point Xera himself would cease to exist. This would unleash a catastrophic amount of power that would be enough for the Dark Queen to harness and obliterate all of reality. In this final engagement in which Legend fought Xera for the last time, charged with the unbelievable power of the 8 Divine Commandments, Xera drew his trump card. He drew Calamity, and he finally decided that enough was enough. He's waited long enough. Enough with this reality. He accepted the terms of the blade, and as that energy started to bubble out of the blade, enough to annihilate reality, is finally when Zack unleashed an unstoppable attack with the Godless Lance, empowered by the remaining 7 Divine Commandments, and struck down Xera. You see, the important thing about Xera is that he possesses a very unique form of complete immortality. His body is completely and utterly impervious to damage. In fact, when Legend threw the Godless Lance at Xera the first time, it technically pierced clean through his torso, but it didn't actually damage Xera. It didn't leave a hole when withdrawn, nor did it have any blood coming from the impact site. It simply just phased through his body without doing any actual damage. This is because Xera is so incredibly powerful, charged by the energy of the Dark Queen, that his body was truly, utterly indestructible. Even the Divine Commandments could do nothing against him individually. However, with the Divine Commandments put together, paired with a being as powerful as Legend was, and as we remember, the Divine Commandments themselves are the pure will and determination of the Origin Jackson, again, charged with the power and unrelenting capabilities of Legend, was just barely enough to strike down Xera in a very permanent manner. Now, of course, we need to talk about why Xera was such a huge problem. As other than the events of the Origin War, it really doesn't seem like Xera's been doing a lot. In fact, it almost seems like he's nothing more than a bystander for the majority of Shattered Legacies. But that's not really the case. You see, that entire time since Xera broke free from the original imprisonment orb used by the Origin Jackson, he's not only been gathering information about reality, but he's also been testing that magic. As I said throughout the entire explanation, his power kept on growing, becoming more powerful with each day that passes. Well, how do you think he was growing that power? Many, many innocent lives were lost. So much so that even all 33 or 34? 33, 34 at the time of the Demon Legion Crusade. So, all 33 Siritan Empires combined, their total kill count doesn't even come close to what Xera was doing. And keep in mind that the kill count of the Siritan Empire, all of them combined, is... the number is so large it's incalculable. It truly is. Because we're not just talking about a single empire within a galaxy like Warhammer 40k. I always compare it to Warhammer 40k because, like I said before, it's heavily inspired, you know. Shatter Legacies takes place over the entirety of the realm of creation. The realm of creation is filled with an infinite number of multiverses. Inside of each and every single multiverse is an infinite number of universes. And within each and every single universe is an infinite number of planets. And every single planet, at least those that are hospitable, could hold billions, maybe even trillions, or in rare cases, quadrillions of people. We can, as a species right now, can barely even fathom 7 billion, coming on 8 billion for our current population. Never mind the sheer population of the Siritan Empire in whatever time period this all happens in. Like I said, we can barely fathom 7 billion. Try and think of trillions or quadrillions of people per planet. It's impossible to think of. And then think of Xera. He's been testing his power since long, long before the Siritan Empire was ever created by the Techno Jackson. In fact, there are thousands upon thousands of Zach Jacksons that existed before Legend, and after Legend, there's 7 to 10 Zach Jacksons between Legend and Techno. And Techno is the one who created the first Siritan Empire. Well, he contributed to it. You know? So, like, Xera has been around for a very long time. Him destroying entire multiverses, it's essentially, again, child's play, especially considering he holds the power of the Dark Queen, who we still don't know who or what it is. But it has enough power that he could basically just click his fingers and use whatever dark energy shenanigans that he's using. Multiple multiverses could just instantly be annihilated, vaporized, and there's not anything the gods can do because there's nobody that can challenge him. Like, it sounds like he's not really doing a lot, but Xera causes so much damage to reality every single time it is reset, up until, honestly, he starts engaging with Legend. You know, that's when things start to get tame, because whilst I explained the major instances in which the two came into contact with each other, it was largely after the second encounter that Legend had with Xera, where he damn near dies, that Legend kind of starts working towards, whoever the hell this guy is, he's a serious problem. Which means I need to mitigate the damage he's doing. I can't beat him. There's not a single possible way in which I'm beating this thing, whatever it is. So I need to mitigate the amount of damage that he does. So whilst Xera's overall destructive capabilities are significantly lessened, largely because of the efforts of Legend, he's still wiped out an incalculable amount of multiverses, having killed so many people. Not only this, but it is theorized that whatever this energy is, it somehow works similar to the Null Void. It's not the Null Void itself, we know that, but it has a similar effect in that once those multiverses are destroyed, which granted there's literally infinite amounts of them, but once they're destroyed, they don't seem to come back after reality is reset. It seems like once they're destroyed by Xera, that's it. They're gone. And again, you can argue that, okay, Let's say that we lose 10 multiverses. There's literally infinite amounts. But you have to remember that infinity within Shattered Legacies is still oftentimes a finite number. Within Shattered Legacies, infinite is thrown around a lot, and it's oftentimes from the perspective of whoever we're currently talking about. Like, if we compare your common Siritan worker to what a lesser god is capable of, their power seems infinite. It seems like there's no end, even though we know that lesser gods are literally the lowest point on the divine totem pole. They're about as far from infinite as you can possibly get. But we see it through the perspective of somebody who is lesser, and as a result, it appears to be infinite, all-encompassing, never-ending power that can do anything. But whilst the same can be said with universes, multiverses, and all that, whilst they truly are unending, there will always be more. No matter how far out you go, there is always more. You're still destroying entire universes, multiverses, and they'll never come back. So suddenly, that truly infinite suddenly has a finite amount. It's no longer going on infinitely, because now you've permanently taken a few out of the equation, which means that suddenly infinite has become a finite number. And as Xera continued to grow more and more and more, more and more and more of these multiverses were lost as a result of this. So essentially, he took infinity and gave it a well-defined, granted not technically well-defined, but a defined finite number. The number might as well still be infinite. We're never going to reach the end. But the fact of the matter is that it's no longer infinity. It's no longer never ending, because he has permanently removed them from the equation. Suddenly, it now has a finite number. We just can't calculate what that number is. So yeah, that is the Dark Lord Xera. We'll go over Cursed Blades at some point. I'm not exactly sure when. Cursed Blades are largely only relevant within the Legend versus Xera arc that exists. And they're largely not that relevant. I mean, technically, yes, Benimaru does hold one of the Cursed Blades, the Cursed Blade Madra, but we'll go over that one when we get to Benimaru's deep dive. As for next Tuesdays, we're probably going to be going over more stuff from the Siritan Empire, specifically the Siritan Empire's super weapon, because we're very slowly but surely getting closer and closer to the point where I can actually explain the Ruin War and actually have you guys kind of understand it. So long as you've actually been following along with all of these episodes, you can actually start to understand a lot of these details. Because there is a lot that goes into the Origin War. We need to know about various different levels of technology that each faction has. We need to know the factions themselves, because each and every single one is a major player in this. We need to know Legend, because Legend is essentially one of the most important roles within the Origin race. We need to know Xera, because frankly, he's just really good to know about, and we've been alluding to him for a while, I think. I could be wrong. But so, we're probably going to be going over the Siritan. Apologies, random yawn. We're probably going to be going over the Siritan Empire's super weapon. We've already gone, I think, over 2 of them. There are 4 different super weapons in total. We know for a fact the Baramons, which is the Scardex, not the Scardix, which I realize now that the 2 names are pretty much identical. The Scardix is the subservient creature to the Baramon, whereas the Scardex is their giant, essentially like Halo Scarab. It's similar. I don't remember when we talked about humanity. I don't remember if I covered the Cyclopses. I'm going to have to go over the humanity episode here tomorrow and see. If we haven't, we'll do a episode on the Cyclops. I'm pretty sure we did. The Cyclops. We haven't talked about the Florians' super weapon because they do have one. And then the Ciritans have one. The Bastilians and Yvetans, they don't have super weapons, largely because they're not technologically advanced. And honestly, their species themselves are kind of super weapons, you know? You don't fuck with the Bastilians because they will rock your world. And you don't fuck with the Yvetans because chances are they know some random ass bullshit spell that can just turn you inside out, regardless of your magical resistance, because that's the Yvetans. Technically, their super weapon would be their Archmages, but we're not getting into that. So I hope you guys enjoyed this admittedly very late episode. I forgot to record it yesterday, so I'm recording it today when it's supposed to be published, so oops. Furthermore, we have the 2 modded survival episodes. As of the time of recording this, right this second, it is almost 7:15, so I'm not going to record the one for Wednesday, i.e. tomorrow, but I will after work tomorrow, and then I will get it uploaded as soon as possible. It was just a little wonky. I ended up streaming and completely forgot that I had to do the Shadow Legacies deep dive yesterday, so a little off schedule, but we'll get there. And then Fridays will still be on Friday, and then we have our Saturday and Sunday live streams of RimWorld and Sunday Night Live at noon Central Standard Time. So, my throat is absolutely annihilated. I will see you guys later. See ya.